any means necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie Luqman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And it's Friday, which means we're having another edition of our weekly segment, the Redspin Report, where we discuss sports, politics, and struggle with Nate Wallace, co-host of the Redspin Sports podcast. Nate, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, glad to be back, Sean and Jacquie.
Absolutely. And of course, Nate, one of the main issues that's been not only in the headlines, but on the minds and consciousness of struggling and progressive people across the world is the issue of the Israeli siege of Gaza and the bombing campaign against Palestinians. Of course, there's a ceasefire that was called, but even amongst that, there was another sort of raid of the Al-Aqsa Mosque by Israeli forces. And this has filtered down into the sports world as well. And we're seeing, high profile athletes like Kyrie Irving commenting on the issue as well. He recently said at a presser, quote, "I'm not going to lie to you guys. A lot of stuff is going on in this world, and basketball is just not the most important thing to me right now. There's a lot of stuff going on overseas. All my people, they're still in bondage all across the world. And there's a lot of dehumanization going on. So I apologize if I'm not going to be focused on your questions. It's just too much going on in the world for me to just be talking about basketball." He added, "It's not just in Palestine. It's not just in Israel. It's all over the world, man. And I feel it. I'm very compassionate to all races, all cultures, and to see a lot of different people being discriminated upon or against based on their religion, color of their skin, what they believe in. We all say we're human beings and we care and we're compassionate. But what are you doing to help?" And Kyrie said that we all need to build, quote, "a community that stands with unity and liberation." Now, that's noteworthy on a couple of levels. I mean, we've seen in recent years, basketball players sort of push back on the notion of, just shut up and dribble, don't have opinions, just entertain us. Certainly this extends to other professional sports like football, just shut up and play basically. And Americans have this very strange thing to where, they don't like politics and sports, even though sports is profoundly political. But I feel like what Kyrie is saying is deeper than even that. He's not just pushing back against, shut up and dribble. He's literally saying that with the broader issues happening on planet Earth, basketball in the broader context is just not that relevant. And that's very noteworthy for any athlete to say about their sport. But I'm generally curious what you're making, not only of Kyrie's comments here, Nate, but, what do you think it sort of says about how deeply this issue sort of has penetrated the popular conscience, if you will, and the impact you think it may have for athletes in professional sports?
I mean, I think it's difficult to overstate how significant it is. And the reason for that is, there's a bunch of reasons. But basically, let's just get to the context of Israel's latest onslaught against Gaza and what Dov Weisglass in Israel, the Israeli government minister who would oversee Gaza and talked about putting Gaza on a diet, and he was known as the calorie counter, were called mowing the lawn. And this is the latest instance of Israel mowing the lawn of their surplus humanity. And they just warehoused in the Gaza Strip in a 30 by 12 kilometer open air prison. You had, I think the evidence for like how much this has changed. Look back at 2014 when Dwight Howard, not really knowing much about the issue, but just being disturbed about what he was seeing, tweeted out "Free Palestine," was literally cornered by, NBA type officials and was told like, "Hey, that's the third rail. You better get that down, apologize." And he quickly came out and said, "I don't really know what I'm talking about. I've never really commented on politics." And, and I might, he probably didn't really know much about it, in fairness. But I think instead of just trashing on Dwight Howard, the bigger point is that, like, as my co-host Michael Sampson always talks about, is like, it's about the movement creating the space for these athletes that, as we've talked about, who have been ensconced from a young age and been, as William Roden writes about in $40 Million Slaves, what do you call it, the conveyor belt? You get on the conveyor belt earlier and earlier, the better you are as a player. And the conveyor belt is the system of runners, of agents, of coaches, of people representing certain schools, shoe companies, all that stuff, that gets these cats at a young age and then kind of pulls them off into another world to where they are alienated from the world in which they were raised in. And it really has a chilling effect on like building solidarity within oppressed communities. I mean, David Falk, Michael Jordan's agent, is notorious for this. And, we talked about that last night on Redspin Sports with Joshua McCoy some. So to get to Kyrie's been on this journey a little bit. He's become a Muslim. He's Kyrie, for context, grew up and went to high school. I mean, he grew up in South Orange, New Jersey, went to high school in Elizabeth, New Jersey, played at the Patrick School, went to Duke for a year, was drafted number 1 overall by the Cleveland Cavaliers, won a title with LeBron James in 2016. But he's always been an interesting cat. I mean, he got ridiculed early in his career for like being a flat earther. He was kind of, I don't know how serious he was with it, but it showed at least that he was like, I think a lot of people, and Justin Williams, another one of our co-hosts, the Redspin, made a good point that a lot of people on the left that break out of the conditioning, the brainwashing that the society puts you in, sometimes have some pretty wacky positions when you first come out of this stuff. I mean, it's like when you're starting to break through the matrix, so to speak, of all the propaganda that's just been thrown at us, like, and growing up in this society. Sometimes it leads to, some off the wall stuff, but it shows that Kyrie has been on this path of seeking, of searching, and recognizing there's something bigger. I think the interesting thing that really I see being in the New York City area and hearing, listening to sports radio, probably a lot more than I should for my own mental health, is listening to the reactions to fans and people in sports media figures to, it's the typical stuff. I mean, the fact that, Kyrie, it's like, okay, yeah, you can, make whatever, money, you can do what you want, we're fine with that, but you're making all this money, and he does. And it's like, that is a fact, but he's also creating a ton of wealth, and he's, and he's challenging this paradigm that is like, you have to put your head down, eliminate all the noise, not focus on anything outside your craft, right? And to be successful, you got to like shut out the people that you grew up with. You got to like sort of isolate yourself. And he's realizing that has led athletes down a dark road. It's one that Craig Hodges, sadly, when he was around and doing his amazing activism in the early 90s, he had no movement backing. That was a time of really the Soviet Union had just fallen, just off the Reagan years. So Craig Hodges, was trying to literally orchestrate a walk-off boycott of the 91 NBA Finals with Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson, who both called him crazy and you're extreme. But now we've gotten to a point where the paradigm has shifted, and it's shifted in a big way. And Kyrie's not afraid. The fact that there's movement backing for him, that he plays to such a level, that he's such an artist on the court and develops his creativity is so immense. So you can't really criticize him for the results. So he has a special ability to kind of transcend some of the restrictions that have been put on guys, some of the things that, the way people can be canceled, and he could still be canceled. And it's funny because the right wing always wants to talk about that, but it's leftists that get canceled far more often than right wing people. But it's a huge sea change. Just listen to Ali Velshi and Joy Reid on MSNBC. I mean, I almost fell out of my chair listening to some of the stuff that's happening. David Ignatius, the Washington Post, who's the mouthpiece of the CIA. If you want Langley's perspective on anything, is on Morning Joe, talking about the need to recalibrate how we look at this. And that's because the CIA is image conscious. You saw the woke, feminism, woke type CIA BS commercial. And it's purely a matter of the CIA realizing that we have a younger generation. There's no monopoly on media. People have cell phones now. Social media, as much as they try to cancel it, they shut people's accounts down. The stuff gets out in the same old tired lines about rockets from Hamas. And they report that, no context, right? They're not pointing out that these people, these are homemade rockets. These aren't military equipment from an army, any kind of organized, fighting regiment. There is no equivalency. This is not a war. As Max Blumenthal always tells me, it's a conquest, not a conflict. And that's stuff that people in this country are starting to wake up to and reckon that we're being part of overseeing an epic genocide right now. And I think that we're starting to see that come to fruition, and the establishment and the ruling class is freaking out about it, but also trying to find a way to co-opt it. And we need to be on the lookout for a Jeremy Corbyn style anti-Semitism smear campaign. Because I don't know what else they're going to resort to at this point.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a danger there. You mentioned Craig Hodges, Nate. I just wanted to say, for anyone interested, about a year ago, he did a really interesting interview with DJ Vlad. I know there's feelings about DJ Vlad, but it's a good interview nonetheless. And I also think it's interesting seeing athletes and NBA players, converting to Islam. I recently found out that Steve Jackson converted to Islam not long ago. I saw him in videos hanging out with a man today known as Amir Junaid Muhadith, but who people may remember as the rapper Loon, who was on Bad Boy Records and had songs like I Need a Girl and things like that. But, that's just an aside. But Jacquie Luqman, wanted to bring you in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the outspokenness is actually spreading in, the NBA. And I think that's going to be a problem, I think, for the NBA as other athletes come out and speak to this issue. I mean, people like Laisha Clarendon, Damian Lillard, Yusuf Nurkic. I always, am careful not to mispronounce people's names. And even soccer, it's I think this outspokenness is spreading across sports in general, because it's not just the NBA, it's also soccer. Soccer stars are speaking out. And, Nate, in the context of the NBA being like the more progressive of the sports leagues, I mean, how does this look for, NBA owners, which, as progressive as they claim to be as a sports leagues, they're still the owners of multi-billion-dollar franchises, and they've got an image to uphold, and a lot of them are just as conservative as NFL owners are. So, I mean, what has been the NBA's response so far, if any?
Honestly, not much. And I think part of it is like Kyrie's, I think, mastery of how to play the media. A lot of people think it's just like, oh, he's just shutting down. He doesn't throughout this season. It's been a constant refrain that, like, I mean, I even heard I usually like Bart Scott, former Ravens and Jets linebacker. But I mean, I'm driving the car on Wednesday afternoon and I hear him making a joke about, and he wasn't even hating on Kyrie. I think this speaks to a larger issue about how normalized a lot of like kind of just jokes are about like Native American culture that I don't think people even saying them necessarily like understand how offensive it is. But he said, I mean, I love, basically I like Kyrie, but, you don't know. I mean, something happens in world politics, that he might just like, have to go out and like camp out in his teepee for a few days and, hit the peace pipe and figure out what to do next. And I'm just like, and nobody like responded, that hasn't been picked up by anybody. That's just like, I got to go back and actually try to find that clip, because no one's picked it up. And it just shows you the kind of people that usually listen to sports radio. And because the idea is that like that, and Bart Scott's not a bad guy. I don't think he meant anything, but it just like, it shows that Kyrie's also been standing in solidarity with Standing Rock tribe, the Sioux tribe, right? And he's been, making connections between, this system, imperialism, what it does, and who the people on the receiving end of on the wrong side of that are, and like realizing that his own identity is part of that, being of having Sioux ancestry himself. I think that like the NBA owners, like there hasn't really been a reaction to this point, because he's also Kyrie. You got to remember, he hasn't just said anything. Like he's not out there like saying something that could easily, where he could just. It's very clear what he's signaling to the people who understand what he's talking about, but he's also being clever enough not to step in one of these traps that will just take the focus away from like what the issues are and just lead to a BS controversy that's going to be like some talking head story on ESPN. So I actually think it is strategic not to be a little ambiguous and vague a little bit, because he, with all the stuff about it's not just Palestine, it's not just Israel, it's all over the world. But people, I think, get where he's coming from, but he's also putting it in a way that's like going to not let the media circus he knows would love to turn something in and twist something he's saying into something else, go down that road. He's learned from past examples of like the way they've done Craig Hodges, and William Roden. I mean, he basically just asked Craig Hodges in 1992 after Game 1 of the NBA Finals, like, what is your response to what's going on in the world? And he started talking about this is in the wake of Rodney King's killers being let off, and he just said we can't stay silent anymore. And this was like that ended up being the kiss of death. It was a contract year. He had tried to stay silent. William Roden, please go read his book $40 Million Slaves, the legendary New York Times columnist, and you're really, I think, one of the just giants of American sports journalism, especially Black sports journalism in America. There's nobody that has more authority on the subject. But that did him in with Jordan, that quote. And you're seeing now that's changed. The dynamics have changed. And I don't think that when you see MSNBC and you see even establishment forces in this country realizing that they have an image problem with Israel, that it's not something they can just fix. The same Hasbara BS is not really being bought. You look at polling data that's showing Americans, like, the views are starting to shift. And the amount of money we're spending that we just consistently spend, I don't know. I mean, I'm more optimistic than I've been in a long time. And I hate to say that given what people in Gaza are dealing with right now, talk about being optimistic. But in terms of the geopolitics of it all, I think that there's some openings here. And I think that we got to keep organizing. And I think players are going to keep doing what they're doing. The ones that speak out, let's not forget Jaylen Brown, the Boston Celtics, who has done a lot. And Kenny Stills, wide receiver in the NFL, who's a take-a-knee vet, who's been around with the Dolphins and Houston Texans. And he's been out there turning up for Palestine this last week. So let's keep supporting these athletes that are doing great stuff. And I'm definitely leaving people out, and I apologize for that. But, everybody who's doing great work should be recognized. And I think we finally have some cause for some cautious optimism.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just so wild how far things have come with professional sports on this issue, even the last few years. I mean, back in 2014, during so-called Operation Protective Edge, when Israeli forces just bombarded Gaza, Dwight Howard, an NBA All-Star, simply tweeted out "Free Palestine," and there was like such outrage against him that he took it down and said, "Previous tweet was a mistake. I have never commented on international politics and never will." So like a complete sort of retreat, if you will, which is the opposite of what we're seeing with Kyrie now. And so, like you say, Nate, I think hopefully things will continue to trend in that direction. But be that as it may, we're going to leave it there for today here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. But we will be back, so please stay with us.
By any means necessary.